This tutorial is for Clue 12 of the Brilliance pattern, which is the Expression Fiber Arts 2024 Mystery Knit Along pattern. And for Clue 12, most of what I'm going to show you has to do with how to bind off your project. So whether you're doing the regular shawl or blanket with the I-cord edge, the regular shawl or blanket with the seed stitch edge, or you're doing one of the symmetrical versions, so the symmetrical version with the I-cord edge or the symmetrical version with the seed stitch edge. I will be walking through the steps to go from the end of working the pattern that we've already brought in from Clue 11 that we're just continuing in Clue 12. So from the end of that to the end of the bind off is basically what I'm going to be working on each one of these. So as with all my other videos, there are timestamps in the video description. You can just click the, in the video description below, you can click more, and a whole list of timestamps will pop up, and you can just jump to the part that is relevant to the part, or you can just jump to the part that's relevant for the version that you're working. I will say, if you are doing one of the symmetrical versions, please jump to the symmetrical introduction before you jump to your specific symmetrical version. There are a couple of tips that I need to make sure you understand before I get started, and rather than cover them for each type, I'm just going to cover them once. So go ahead and figure out which version you're working, and then jump to the tutorial for that. Okay. If you are doing the regular shawl or blanket with the I-cord edges, once you've worked your set 6, that is, worked rows 1 through 8 3 times with colors K and L, or your final, the 6th color set, once you've finished row 8, you can then cut your dark color, your color K. You want to leave a tail long enough to weave in. And you do want to leave your working yarn for your color L, your light color working yarn, and your light color bobbin, or your color L bobbin, attached. Now, that is a recent, so when this clue first was released, that wasn't in there. It specifically didn't tell you not to cut your bobbin. So if you have already cut your bobbin, it's okay. I'm going to show you how to work around that. There is a update. So if this is where you are, if you just finished row 8 and you haven't cut anything yet, go download the updated version of the pattern so that you have that instruction. But if you haven't cut your bobbin yet, don't cut your bobbin yet. At the end of working rows 1 through 8, the final time on your piece, we're going to work final rows 1 through 4. So final rows 1 through 4, I will go ahead and work them on my swatch, even though it's going to take a minute here. So I'm just going to work through those real quick. So final row 1, after you slip the marker, you're going to do a purl 1. You're just doing this with your light colored yarn, and you're going to slip 1 with yarn and back, knit 4, slip 1 with yarn and back, and repeat that. Slip 1 with yarn and back, knit 4, slip 1 with yarn and back, and then purl 1, and then slip your edge marker and work your edge stitches. Now, because your bobbin is still attached, I would strongly recommend that you do still switch to your bobbin to work these edge stitches each time, because we are going to be using the bobbin later on, and you want that bobbin yarn to be in the right place to use it when you need it. If you've already cut your bobbin yarn, just use your light color to your color L yarn to work all of the final rows 1 through 4. As I said, I will provide a workaround later in the bind off if you've already cut your bobbin. Final row 2. Work those edge stitches with the bobbin. Slip your stitch marker. And if you recall, when you switch from your bobbin to your working yarn, you're just gonna always, every time you're switching, you're bringing the yarn that you just finished working with across the top to the left, picking up the yarn that you're gonna work with next across the bottom to the right, and then make your first stitch. So knit one. And then this was also an error that got updated. So if your pattern says slip one with yarn in back, it actually means slip one with yarn in front. So you're going to slip one with yarn in front and then purl 4. Slip one with yarn in front and repeat that. Slip one in yarn with yarn in front, purl 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Slip one with yarn in front. And then knit 1, slip your stitch marker, work your edge stitches, turn to the front, final row 3, work your edge stitches, slip your stitch marker, purl 1, slip one with yarn in back, knit 4, 2, 3, 4, slip one with yarn in back, repeat, slip one with yarn in back, knit 4, 3, 4, slip one with yarn in back, purl 1, slip your stitch marker, and then switch to your bobbin yarn. So working yarn comes across the top to the left, bobbin yarn gets picked up across the bottom on the right, work the edge stitches with the bobbin yarn, and that's the end of final row 3. And then final row 4 is going to be different than the regular row 4 that you've been working. So work the edge stitches with your bobbin, slip your stitch marker, and then switch again from your bobbin to your working yarn. So bobbin comes across the top to the left, working yarn comes across the bottom to the right, and you're going to knit 1, and then we're going to purl to 1 stitch before the marker. So this is different. Normally you would knit the stitches you've been working and slip the stitches you've been slipping, but in this case we're going to purl all the way across till 1 stitch before the marker. And then knit that, slip your stitch marker, and then work your edge stitches. And that is the end of final row 4. So at the end of your final row 4, you should have this section above your diamonds that, because we've done the slipped stitch on those rows, even though it's in the same color, it's going to help lift up that final diamond so it doesn't flatten on the top. So from this point, you're going to jump down to where it says on page 61, where it says bind off blanket shawl with I-cord edge. Okay, so to begin doing this bind off, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to slide our stitches to the other end of the needle. So technically it's going to end up being your right needle, or your left pointing needle is where you want your stitches, but you basically want, when the right side of your work is facing you, you want the bobbin side of your project to be at the tip of that needle pointing to your left. If you had already cut your bobbin before I told you not to, don't fret. Don't reattach your bobbin. Don't try to work the edge stitches the way that I'm showing here. I am going to show you an alternate way to do what I'm doing here. It's just going to come at the end of the bind off. So I will make a point to tell you when that is. So if you've already cut your bobbin, just hang on through this part and then I'll tell you when to pick it back up. Okay, so if you haven't cut your bobbin, what you want to do here is actually take your, you want to slip these 5 edge stitches that you've been working with the bobbin to your left needle very carefully. So it's really important that at the end of your work here that your stitches are very clean, okay, especially these edge stitches. So make sure that you're slipping the stitches cleanly and that you're working them cleanly, or your border won't look quite perfect. Okay, so once you've slipped your stitches to your left needle, you want to work those stitches on the front. So knit, yarn front, slip, yarn back, knit, yarn front, slip, yarn back, knit, and that is your Bobbin W5E1. Then you're going to turn to the back of your work and you're going to work those 5 edge stitches across the back with the bobbin. So slip the first stitch with the yarn in front, yarn back and knit the next stitch, yarn front and slip this 3rd stitch, yarn back and knit the 4th stitch, yarn front and slip the 5th stitch, and then you are actually going to slip all 5 of those stitches back to what is now your left needle. Okay, just make sure you're slipping them really cleanly. So when you turn to the front, everything should be back on one side. And then from this point, after you have worked those stitches and gotten them back on the your left pointing needle, once they're back on there, you can go ahead and cut your bobbin yarn. And again, you just want to cut with a tail long enough to weave in at the end, okay? From there, go ahead and slip your stitches all the way back to the other end, so they are on your right pointing needle, or closest to your right pointing needle. And from here, we are going to begin working the actual bind off. So when you actually do begin the bind off steps, you're going to want to switch your needle size back to the size needle that you used to cast on at the very beginning of the project. So for me, I went from, with my Clue 12, I was working with a US 6 or a 4mm needle, and now I'm back to a US 2.5 or a 3mm needle. And you do want to go ahead and switch out both of your needles at this point for the smaller needle that you use to do the cast on. And what that's going to do is that's going to keep our bind off row, our bind off I-cord from flaring out on the edges. Okay, so we're going to make it a little bit narrower. It will stretch more from left to right than our project is going to if you bound off with the same needle size that you use to work your Clue 12, it would be too stretchy. All right, from here, we're going to actually work the I-cord edge stitches twice, so on the front and the back 2 times. So with this smaller size needle, you're just going to knit the first stitch, yarn front, slip the 2nd stitch, knit the 3rd stitch, yarn front, slip the 4th stitch. Again, make sure you're doing this nice and clean, and then yarn back, knit the 5th stitch, and then turn to the back. You can remove your stitch marker at this point. I'd recommend doing that so it's just not in your way. And then slip the 1st stitch. We're just working back to the end here. Yarn back, knit the 2nd stitch, yarn front, slip the 3rd stitch, yarn back, knit the 4th stitch, yarn front, slip the 5th stitch. And we're just going to do that one more time. So knit, yarn front and slip, knit, yarn front, slip, knit, turn to the back, slip, yarn back, knit, yarn front, slip, yarn back, knit, yarn front, slip. And what this is doing, it's just giving us some height on this edge so that when the I-cord turns the corner, as we do the bind off, it doesn't end up pulling in on that edge so that we get a nice square corner. And from here, we're going to be doing the actual bind off rows. So bind off row 1 and bind off row 2. We're going to be doing that over and over again all the way until we bind off this stitch that's right before the marker at the end. So the steps for the bind off are knit the first stitch, yarn front, slip, yarn back, knit the third stitch, yarn front, slip the fourth stitch, and then we're going to go yarn back, and we're going to actually knit the next stitch, so the last stitch of the edge, together through the back loop with the first actual body stitch. So just going to knit those two together through the back loop. And that binds off one stitch. Then we're going to turn back to the back, and we're going to work those 5 stitches back to the edge. Slip, knit, slip, knit, slip. Okay, let me show you that again. To bind off the next stitch, we're going to work the I-cord, the first 4 stitches. So knit, slip, knit, slip, and then yarn back, and then we're going to knit 2 together through the back loop, this last stitch of the edge with the next stitch in the body. So knit those 2 together through the back loop, and then turn to the back, and then work those 5 stitches back to the edge. Slip, yarn back and knit, yarn front, slip, yarn back, knit, yarn front, slip. And you're just going to continue doing that all the way until you bind off the stitch that is next to the marker. So rather than make you watch me do it over and over again, I am going to jump ahead to that stitch before the marker. Okay, so once you have you've got your 5 edge stitches, and then you have one more stitch remaining to be bound off before the stitch marker, you're going to go ahead and work the same thing. So work the 5 edge stitches, 1, slip 1, knit 1, slip 1, and then you're going to knit this last stitch together through the back loop with that last stitch before the edge marker, and then go ahead and remove the other stitch marker, turn to the back, and work back across. Knit 1 or slip 1, knit 1, slip 1, knit 1, slip 1. All right, so now you have just your 5 edge stitches on your left side and your 5 edge stitches that are coming across the top here. We're going to go ahead and work across these 5 stitches one more time, but we're just going to work in one direction. So this is where it's going to change slightly. If you had already cut the bobbin previously in your work and you were not able to work that row to begin your bind off, we're going to do something different. So assuming that you didn't have the bobbin to work the edge stitches, you are actually going to work across the edge here. So go ahead and work those 5 stitches. Knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, and then you would turn. Again, this is if you didn't have the bobbin, turn, work back across, to the end, and then turn and work across the front again. Like so. All right, and that gets you set up to bind off the I-cord edges to each other. Now, if you did, in fact, have the bobbin and work those 5 stitches across the front and back before you started doing the bind off, then you do not want to work that extra row on the stitches that are coming across the top. So I'm actually going to undo those last 5 stitches that I did, because I did work with the bobbin here. So put those back on my needle. All right. So when you are finished, whichever way you end up doing it, if you use the bobbin to make the extra row here, or if you made the extra row here because you'd already cut your bobbin, you're going to end with your working yarn tail is going to be at the left side of these stitches that are coming across the top of your work now. So the next step that we need to do is to reorder the edge stitches on both needles so that they're in the correct order to Kitchener stitch them together. So right now, the way that we worked our I-cord edge is different than you would typically work I-cord. So first of all, I-cord is typically just 3 stitches, where you would knit across 3 stitches, and then when you turn to the other side, you just slip them all back across, and then you knit across one side, slip across the other side. If you were doing a 5-stitch I-cord, you do the same thing. You'd work all 5 stitches on one side, and then you would slip the yarn across. You'd slip all 5 stitches back and just pull the yarn across the slip stitches. And over time, the slipped yarn is going to kind of incorporate into each of the stitches, and it'll lengthen them a little bit, but basically it's going to pull them into that tube shape that we're familiar with the I-cord. So the reason that we work the I-cord differently for this project is, one, because it's a little tidier, and especially if you're doing a 5-stitch I-cord, sometimes that cord does not pull all the way into that tube, and so you end up with a gap on the back side. And so this way you don't get that back gap on the back side. But the more important reason that we worked the I-cord this way is because when we're so we work a stitch, and then we move the yarn to basically wrap the stitch that we're not working, and then we work the next stitch, and then we move the yarn to wrap the stitch we're not working. And when you do that, you're actually giving the I-cord height. And so typical I-cord is basically a row of knitting, or a row of I-cord for every 2 rows of knitting. And so you're working across the I-cord, but then when you slip it back, you're not giving it any height. And so this gives it a little bit more height to accommodate the 2 rows of knitting that goes with each technically row of I-cord. Because if you think about it, when you work your I-cord stitches, you don't actually work every stitch on the front and work every stitch on the back. You work the 1st, 3rd, and 5th stitch on the front, and then the 2nd and 4th stitch on the back. And so when we want to Kitchener stitch these together, we have to put them in the order that they actually get worked. Not moved, but actually worked. And so for each needle, we're going to go through and we're going to put them back in, we're going to put them in working order. So what I did in the pattern instructions was I gave you basically, if you look at the order of the stitches from the tip of the needle to the cable. So if you look at the order of stitches this way, let me see. Grab me a little pointer here. So if you look at the stitches going in this direction, so whether it's from this tip to this cable or from this tip to this cable, the stitches are not in numerical order. They're not in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're actually in 1, 5, 2, 4, 3. And that goes over here too. 1, 5, 2, 4, 3. And so what we need to do is we need to go through and pick up stitches to put them in order and get them on the cable so that they're in the correct order. So this is how I do it. You can find another way to do it. You're welcome to do it whatever way you want. If you're really brave, you can actually just slip the stitches off the needle and then pick them back up in a different order. What I like to do is I like to get another needle and then slip my stitches that I'm going to reorder down onto the cable. So I'm going to reorder these stitches first. So right now they're in 1, 5, 2, 4, 3 order. I'm going to turn to the back and I'm going to pick up these stitches in the order that they need to go back onto the needle. So I'm going to pick up the last stitch first, and I'm just going to go through each stitch and pick it up onto my spare needle. If you look here from the end, I'm skipping this first one, and I'm going into the second one, skipping the third one, going into that fourth one and skipping the fifth one, and then I'm going to pull that up onto my cable, and then I'm going to turn back around to the front. And hopefully my cable comes with me. All right, and then I'm going to pick up the stitches that I didn't pick up the first time. So I skipped this one, so I'm going to pick up this last one over here, skip the next one, pick up this middle one. And again, I want to just make sure I'm getting cleanly through the stitch. Skip the fourth one and then get through that last one. Okay, and then I'm actually going to pull the cable that they are currently on, that needle, I'm going to actually push it out of the stitches. You just want to make sure you're pulling the correct one out, okay? So that's the one that all the stitches were on. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull my cable so that all the stitches are in a row. And so when I do this, I'm going to try to show you in slow motion. So I'm going to kind of pinch that all together here, and then I'm going to pull on my cable from both directions. And you'll see as it moves toward that bend in the cable, my stitches are going to spread out, and then they're just going to pop together, okay? So right now, my stitches are now in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 order, with one over here being the stitch that's closest to my body of my work, and then it's going to wrap around to the stitches that are in the back. So I'm actually going to push it so that I can move these stitches tip to tip back to the needle that I'm going to be working on. And so that the point of my needle is, the stitch that's closest to the point of my needle is the stitch that's closest to the body. Okay, so I'm just going to slip these one at a time to my working needle, tip to tip, purlwise, and I'm going to just make sure I'm slipping each stitch nice and clean, because when I Kitchener these together, if I don't get through them nice and clean, I'm not going to be able to adjust my Kitchener stitch at all. So I'm just going to tighten everything down, make sure it's all nice and snug. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this other needle. Okay, so again, I have a needle with a very long cable that is very bendy because it's been in storage for a while. So it's getting tangled up in my yarn a little bit. Okay, so again, these stitches over here on my left needle are out of order, and what I want to do is I want to come in and pick up these stitches that are going to be on the back first, because I want this stitch to be the closest to the tip of my needle when I'm done. So I'm going to come across the back here, and I'm going to skip the first stitch. So I've turned to the back, all right, and those stitches, I'm going to skip the first stitch, and I'm going to pick up that second stitch, skip the third stitch, pick up that fourth stitch, and then I'm going to pull my needle that I'm picking those up onto through so that those stitches are on the cable. Then I'm going to turn back to the front, and I am going to pull my work down onto the cable for this, just because it's a little easier to pick up when the stitches are on the cable than when they're on the needle. So then I'm going to go through this first stitch on the left first, skip the second stitch, go into that third stitch, skip the fourth stitch, and go into that fifth stitch. Okay, so you can see they're all on my needle. And at this point, I'm going to push the needle, the working needle, out of all those stitches. So pull those up on my cable, and then push them all off of my working needle. And then again, I'm going to pull my cable until all those stitches pop together. Okay, so again, it's gonna pull, it's gonna kind of stretch them out a little bit, and then they're gonna pop together. And remember, I want this stitch that's closest to the body to be on my needle that's pointing to my right. And so I'm actually going to transfer my stitches to that needle so my needle's going to point the other direction when I transfer them. So I'm going to put those back on my working needle. And I'm going to do that again, one at a time and very cleanly. Okay, so at this point, your stitches will be set up and ready to do the Kitchener stitch join. You want to take your needles and fold them together. So I want to say it's the wrong side of the work is what's moving together, but it's really just the wrong side of your edge stitches, because that's all that's actually going to fold together at this point. You want to pull your working yarn. Your working yarn is going to be attached to the first stitch on this back needle. So kind of go over, if you've never done Kitchener stitch or it's been a while, the needle closest to you is your front needle. The needle further away from you is your back needle. And then you're going to be attaching your yarn to a Kitchener needle or a tapestry needle. I highly recommend that you get a, let me show you this. I highly recommend that you get a tapestry needle that is blunt. Okay, so my gold needle over here, or my orange needle, is blunt. My tapestry needle over here, the silver one, is not. It's got much more of a point. So if you are working with a pointy tapestry needle, it is highly probable that you're going to end up splitting a stitch and basically pulling your yarn through a split stitch. So I recommend a blunt needle. It helps you get into the stitch a little bit cleaner. If you are using a more pointy tapestry needle, be sure that you're not splitting your stitch. Be very careful to go into each stitch very cleanly. Okay, so from here, you're going to want to cut a tail on your working yarn. I recommend a longer than you think you need tail, because you can always cut it short later, but if you run out of yarn, you're going to be very unhappy because redoing it is not easy. Taking it out and redoing it is not easy. So I say to cut a tail at least 5 times as long as the stitches that are on your needle, and I would be generous with that. So that long plus a tail to weave in, so that gives me a good foot at least. Okay, so foot, 18 inches. Just make sure you have plenty of yarn to work with when you do this. I recommend when you thread your tapestry needle that you basically pull the yarn almost double in it. So you want a little bit of, let's see if I can show this without it popping out. So you want a little bit of yarn, an inch or two at the end where it's just a single strand of yarn. But with it doubled up, it's just a lot easier to pull through, and it's a lot less likely that you're going to accidentally pull the yarn off of your tapestry needle when you do this. So the Kitchener stitch join, this is just a very straightforward, we're just doing stockinette Kitchener stitch, which means we're going to be doing one setup stitch on the front needle, one setup stitch on the back needle, and then we're going to be doing the same 4 motions over and over again. To begin, we're going to set up the stitch on the front needle by going into, we're going to take our tapestry needle and go into that first stitch on the front needle as if to purl. And we're just going to pull that yarn through. I want you to think, like once you start to feel the tension of the yarn to its previous stitch, go ahead and stop pulling. We are creating an entire row of stitches here. And so if you pull it tight, you're going to have your I-cord come up to a very itty-bitty row of I-cord. And while Kitchener stitch can be adjusted after you've finished, if you make it too tight, it's harder to adjust than if you make it too loose. So err on the side of making it too loose, because it's a lot easier to tighten it from the end where you start to the tail once than to try to pull extra from the tail back to the end where you started and get each stitch the right size. So just when you pull, don't pull it through really, really tight. You just want to leave a little bit of, I want to say air, but you basically want to imagine that you have a needle in here, that your stitches that you're making are going tightly around or snugly around a needle. And so that's kind of the amount of give that you want in your yarn between stitches. Okay, so we did our setup on the front. We went into the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl. To do our setup on the back, we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit. And then we can begin our four-step repeat. So the 4-step repeat is go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and take it off. Go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. Okay, those 4 steps again. Go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. And you just want to pull your stuff, your yarn through gently each time. Go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. That's the second step. The third step, go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the fourth step is to go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. And you just want to be very careful that your yarn is not wrapping around your needles when you do this. Just kind of watch your yarn as you make it. Okay, so that repeat again. First stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. Next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. First stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. Next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. Do that again. First stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. Next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. First stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. And next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. And then to finish this off, we're just going into that last stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. And then go into that last stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. All right, so it's going to look a little messy when you get it all off. But the first thing you want to do is kind of pull your corner out, okay, and see where you are. At this point, your I-cord should actually start to wrap around from the front to the back. Remember, we reordered all those stitches when we did this, and so we had them all flat, and now they need to curl back around. So that's kind of the first thing. And then you just want to check your edge. You want to kind of see where you are. From here, I like to take my tapestry needle and just kind of tug on each leg of the stitch, and I want to cinch it down one leg at a time. So I'm just going to follow it around. So I'm going to kind of pull that tight, and I'm going to follow this up here. Pull that tight, follow it over here and pull it. So I don't want to pull it tight. I want to pull it so that it looks like about the same size stitch as what I've already made. So you're just going to kind of follow these legs around all the way to the back. Pull that excess toward the tail each time. Okay. So pull each leg. Make sure you're not pulling anything but the leg. And that goes to my tail. So then once you've got it all the way you want it, go ahead and cinch down your tail. And then it's time to block. So once you're done, you should have a continuous I-cord edge that really nicely frames your project, that if you have everything cinched correctly at the beginning and at the end, you shouldn't even be able to tell where your I-cord begins and ends. It should just be one very smooth, continuous loop around your project. So that is how to bind off for Clue 12 with the I-cord edge. If you are doing the regular blanket or regular shawl with the seed stitch edge, first of all, congratulations, you get the easiest bind off. As a matter of fact, finishing out Clue 12 and doing the bind off is fairly simple. I am going to go ahead and walk through it, but I doubt you're going to need me because it's pretty straightforward. So once you've worked your rows 1 through 8 3 times on of Clue 12, that using your colors K and L, you're just going to work your final rows 1 through 4. So final row 1, you're just going to work you're going to always work your seed stitch edge the way that you normally do. So slip 1 knitwise with yarn in front, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, and then we're actually, so final rows 1 through 3 are actually just working your the same as rows 1 through 3 of clue 11 and 12. You're just doing it with one color. So rather than switching to your color K to work this row, you're just going to stick with your color L. So actually you can cut your color K once you've worked rows 1 through 8. You don't need that anymore. Just make sure you cut it with a long enough tail that you can weave in when you're done. Okay, so once you've slipped the edge marker, you're going to purl 1, and then you're going to slip 1 with yarn and back, knit 4, slip 1 with yarn and back, and repeat that, slip 1 with yarn and back, knit 4, slip 1 with yarn and back, and then when you get to the end, purl 1, slip your stitch marker, and then work your edge stitches. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. And that's the end of final row 1. Turn to the back, final row 2. Again, work your edge stitches as normal. So slip the first stitch knitwise with yarn in front, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, slip your stitch marker. Oh, by the way, you can actually, with the seed stitch edge, you could have cut your bobbin yarn too. So again, leave a tail as long as you need with that to weave in, and also cut your tail at the end of, technically you did that at the end of row 8, right? We're pretending like you're already done. All right, so after you slip your stitch marker, you're going to knit 1, and then you're going to slip 1 with yarn in front, and then, whoops, purl 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and slip 1 with yarn in front. By the way, if your pattern says for final row 2, if it says to slip 1 with yarn in back, that is an error. Also your so if it says that, there is an update to the pattern available, and you can go get that, but it is we're still slipping it the same way that we did with the pattern. So again, that repeat, slip 1 with yarn in front, purl 4, slip 1 with yarn in front, and then when you get to the end and have 1 stitch left, you're going to knit that last stitch, slip your stitch marker, and then work your edge stitches as usual. So knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and that is the end of final row 2. To work final row 3, work your edge stitches as normal, slip 1 knitwise with yarn in front, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, slip your stitch marker, purl the first stitch, and then slip 1 with yarn in back, knit 4, slip 1 with yarn in back, and do that again, slip 1 with yarn in back, knit 4, slip 1 with yarn in back, and you're just going to do that repeat until you have 1 stitch remaining, and you're going to purl that, slip your stitch marker, work your edge stitches, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and then we're going to work final row 4. So final row 4 is slightly different than our regular clue 11 and 12 rows. So work your edge stitches as normal. Slip that first stitch knitwise with yarn in front. Purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, slip your stitch marker, then you're going to knit 1, and you're going to purl across until 1 stitch before the edge marker. So yes, you are going to purl those stitches that you would normally be slipping on this row. And then when you get to that last stitch, you're going to knit that, slip your stitch marker, and then work your edge stitches, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. So that concludes the main part of Clue 12, and from there you want to go to page 61, where it reads bind off blanket shawl with seed stitch edge. And the bind off instructions are as follows. You want to switch to the needle that you use to work your Clue 1, your cast on and your Clue 1. So for me, I'm switching from a size 6 or a US 6, which is a 4mm needle, down to a US 2.5, which is a 3mm needle. And so I'm just going to work from the needle that I have my stitches on to a new needle, but you can just, because you're going down to a smaller needle size, you can just slide all your stitches onto your cable and swap both needles if you want to. Okay, so from here we're going to do seed stitch edge rows 1 through 4. So seed stitch edge row 1, we're going to begin with our edge stitches as usual. Slip 1 with yarn in front knitwise, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, and then we're going to remove our marker, and then we're going to be working a purl 1, knit 1 until 2 stitches from the next marker. So we're just going to purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. Whoops, that was 2 stitches, sorry. So when you have 2 stitches remaining before your marker, you're actually going to purl those 2 stitches together. And then you can remove your other stitch marker, and then you're just going to work those 5 edge stitches, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and then you're going to work your seed stitch edge row 2, which is pretty much like our beginning rows. So you're always going to slip this first stitch knitwise with the yarn in front, and then you're just going to work purl 1, knit 1, all the way to the end. Knit, purl, 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 knit. So 4 rows, seed stitch edge rows 3 and 4, you're just going to work that row 2 more times where you're just doing you're going to start with the slip one knitwise with the yarn in front, and then purl knit, purl knit, purl knit, purl knit, all the way to the end of the row. So I'm not going to make you watch me do that twice, so we're going to skip ahead here to the bind off. Okay, so once you've done your rows, once you've done your seed stitch edge rows 1 through 4, it's time to bind off, and I recommend that you bind off in pattern using the simple stretchy bind off, which actually give you the instructions for on page 59 right after the continuous swatch instructions. The reason I chose this bind off is because you do want a fairly stretchy edge, and it'll look better if you bind off in pattern as opposed to binding off straight or flat. So you are going to go ahead and slip that first stitch knitwise with the yarn in front as normal. And then I would, so you can work it both ways. You can work it either way. So you can knit the stitch because it's a knit stitch, so you can work the stitch as it presents, or you can work this like you're doing another row of purl one, knit one all the way across, which is what I would recommend. So rather than work the next stitch as a knit stitch, I would purl it like you're going ahead and doing that purl one, knit one. So you're going to purl a stitch, and then you're going to take those 2 stitches that are on your right needle, and you're actually just going to purl them together like that. And then you're going to work the next stitch like it's a knit stitch. And then you're going to knit those 2 together through the back loop. So purl a stitch, and then purl those 2 stitches on the right needle together, and then knit a stitch, and then knit those 2 stitches together through the back loop. Purl a stitch, purl 2 together, knit a stitch, knit those together through the back loop, purl a stitch, purl those 2 together, knit a stitch, knit 2 together through the back loop. And you're just going to continue working this all the way down to the end of your row. And when you get to that final stitch, you can just knit them together through the back loop. You can also bring this last stitch off and over, and then bring your tail through. I think that'll make it look a little bit cleaner than actually working that knit 2 together through the back loop on that last stitch. But again, it's up to you. When you're done, you should have a very solid seed stitch edge that frames your entire project, with enough stretchiness on both your top edge and your bottom edge to block out to whatever dimensions you want your project to end up at. I would recommend that you jump ahead to my blocking recommendations before you leave the video, because I do have a couple of suggestions for blocking that'll make your piece look nicer. If you are doing any of the symmetrical versions, so whether you're doing the shawl or blanket, if you're doing the I-cord edge or you're doing the seed stitch edge, I strongly recommend that you sit through listening through and watching this introduction before you actually jump to your specific project type, because there are several explanations and several recommendations that I want to be sure to pass along before you get started. So first of all, I am only demonstrating the Kitchener stitch join. It is not required that you do the Kitchener stitch join. It is going to be more complex, it is going to be more time consuming, and it is going to be fiddly. There are things that you need to do to get it to look right. So when you do get it to look right, it will be virtually invisible. It will look like you made one piece that just from one end to the other is symmetrical from the ends to the center. But I say virtually invisible because technically you will know where the join is, And a really experienced knitter, if they know what they're looking for, should be able to find it. But most people will not be able to tell that your two pieces were once two pieces once you've joined them. But if you don't want to do the Kitchener stitch, there are other ways to join them. I list them in the pattern. And if you want to do one of those other ones, I'm not demonstrating them in this video, but I'm happy to demonstrate them. You just need to let me know that you'd like to see them, and I'll be happy to make a video. So first of all, there's a few things that I wanted to explain. Kitchener stitch is normally worked, so the most common Kitchener stitch you're going to see is connecting knit stitches to knit stitches. And so it is worked in a sequence that creates a new row of knit stitches between two other rows of knit stitches. So a row of knit stitches over here, a row of knit stitches over here, and then the Kitchener stitch creates one more row of knit stitches between them to bring them together. Less commonly, you also will see Kitchener stitch used to make reverse stockinette. That is, it takes purl stitches on one side, purl stitches on the other side, and creates a row of purl stitches to bring those together. We're not doing either one of those, at least not at the beginning and end of our project. So especially for the seed stitch, we're actually going to be using a combination of we're going to be using our Kitchener to make knits and purls across our seed stitch edge and into that first. So if you remember, when we work the project, after we do the edge stitches, the 5 stitches at the edge, on the front of the work, we always purl the first stitch inside the edge marker and purl the last stitch before the edge marker before we get to the final edge. And then on the wrong side of the work, we always knit that stitch. And so on the seed stitch version, you're going to be working all of the seed stitches in their sequence. We're going to be using Kitchener to create another row of seed stitch, and we're going to work that purl stitch. But then once you get to the body, you are going to be working the same, you are going to be basically working stockinette Kitchener stitch across the body. And then when you get to the end, you have to do that purl stitch and then the seed stitch again. On the I-cord edge, you're going to be doing stockinette to join the I-cord. We do have to do we have to kind of rearrange the I-cord before we can do that though. But then we are going to be working that purl stitch. So we're going to be working 5 stockinette stitches and then a purl stitch and then stockinette for the body and then a purl stitch and then the 5 edge stitches in stockinette again. And so it's not as straightforward as just working Kitchener stitch. So there are a few things I just wanted to kind of get out of the way up front so that I don't have to go through them, so that I'm not making each video really long explaining them per type. So the first thing is when you're doing your Kitchener stitch, so you're going to have your pieces with the wrong sides facing each other as you're going to join them. So when I'm talking about things, I'm talking about the needle that's closest to you is going to be your front needle. The needle that's further away from you is going to be your back needle. And then the needle that's going to have your working yarn attached to it is your tapestry needle. So that's kind of just the basics of front needle, back needle, tapestry needle. Okay. Now, recommendations. So first of all, err on the side of working your Kitchener stitch too loosely. Loose is better than tight. Loose stitches can be fixed. And I actually, so at the end of this introduction, I'm gonna put up a video showing how I connect these two, the seed stitch edge. But I worked my Kitchener stitch very loosely. I'm going to show how to work the stitches, the loose stitches over to the tail of your working yarn. So essentially, if you work your stitches too tight, you've got to figure out from your tail how much yarn you need to distribute all the way back through all of your stitches. And obviously your stitches are going to be a whole lot more stitches than my stitches. If you leave excess as you're working, it is really simple, or it is far simpler to work that excess to the tail, just kind of pulling it along through the stitches over to the tail one time, than it is to try to figure out from your tail how much excess yarn you need to pull into the beginning to get enough excess all the way back across to your stitches at the other end. And if you work your Kitchener stitch too tightly, it is going to be very obvious. So you want your Kitchener stitch row to be the same height as your other stitches. So if you work it too loosely, it's really easy to tighten it down to the correct size. If you work it too tightly, it is very difficult to loosen it to the correct size. So that's recommendation number 1, loose is better than tight. Recommendation number 2, lifelines are helpful, okay? Once you get into the body of doing the Kitchener stitch, once you're doing it on the body stitches, you're basically working the same 4-stitch sequence over and over and over again. And so once you get into the body stitches, it's easier, but when you're working on these edge stitches, so basically it's the 7 stitches at the beginning and the 7 stitches at the end. If you mess up, it can be very difficult to get your, to undo what you've done, to go back and restart. And if you have a lifeline in, at least in those first, let's say 10 stitches at the end, 10 stitches on either end, if you have that lifeline in there, it's easier to get your stitches put back and undo what you've already done. So I would recommend putting a lifeline in just in case you need to undo it, because it's a little bit of work up front to eliminate a lot of work later on. Recommendation number 3, you want to make sure that by the time you get to the row that you're going to be binding off, that all your stitches are on there very cleanly. As you're working your final rows, you just want to make sure that you haven't split any stitches, that you haven't snagged any other parts of yarn. And then as you're working, as you're pulling your yarn through with your tapestry needle, you also want to make sure that you are going into each stitch. You're going actually in through the loop and not catching any part of the yarn. So for that reason, I strongly recommend that you use a blunt tapestry needle as opposed to a sharp tapestry needle. So I don't know how easily you can see this. Let me see if I can, maybe if I put it up against something that's kind of plain, you can see. But so my gold needle, or my orange needle here, is a blunt tapestry needle. So it has a pretty rounded edge. My silver needle is actually a fairly sharp needle. It's got a pretty strong point on it. And if you work your Kitchener stitch with a tapestry needle that has a sharp point on it, you're more likely to snag little pieces of your stitches that you're working into. And if you snag a stitch, it will make it much more difficult to actually adjust your stitches afterward, because pulling your yarn tail, or pulling the excess yarn through a snagged stitch, it's going to catch, and the more you try to adjust it into that, it's going to make it look really messy. So you want to make sure that you're working clean stitches into clean stitches. The other part of that is, as you're working your stitches, you want to make sure, very, very sure, that you're always pulling your yarn. You're kind of watching where it's going as you're working through the stitches. And so if you have your, for instance, if you're working a stitch, you always want your working yarn to be coming from the previous stitch underneath the needles and not over the needles. So you don't want a situation where you end up with your working yarn coming over the needle at some point, and making it almost create another stitch or something like that, okay? And so you want to watch your yarn as you're working each stitch and just make sure, and you always want to go, when you're bringing your yarn from one, either from the front to the back or the back to the front, you want to always make sure you're coming in between and underneath the needles and not over the needles, okay? Recommendation number 4, cheat sheets. So I have written up a cheat sheet for both the I-cord join and the seed stitch join. So the I-cord bind off, this is my cheat sheet. I'll kind of walk through my shorthand here. So basically my cheat sheet shows me on the front needle what I'm doing, on the back needle what I'm doing. Each of these, so with the exception of my start and my end, each thing is a set. Okay, so it is the sequence of how I work the stitches on the front needle and the back needle. So you start and you do the front and then the back, and then you do the front and the back, the front and the back, and 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 so on. So the little exponent O, so that's just my off. That's basically I'm going to knit this stitch and take it off the needle. And if it doesn't have the exponent, then I'm leaving it on the needle. And so for my symmetrical I-cord bind off, I know I'm going to start by making a purl stitch on the front needle. So this is always into the first stitch on the front needle, or the first stitch on the designated needle. So purl stitch into the first stitch on the front needle, knit stitch into the first stitch on the back needle. And then I'm going to be working this sequence of 4 moves 4 times. So I'm going to, on the front needle, I'm going to go into the first stitch as if to knit and take it off, and go into the next stitch as if to purl and leave it on. And then I'm going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and take it off, and go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. So I'm going to work through that sequence 4 times. And then I'm going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and take it off, and go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to knit and leave it on. First stitch on the back needle as if to purl and take it off. Next stitch on the back needle as if to purl and leave it on. So I'm just going to work this all the way to the end. And here, where it says rep to 7 stitches from the end, this is the sequence that gets repeated over and over and over again. So same thing with my my symmetrical seed stitch bind off. It's just the repeats at the beginning are smaller. So we're doing these 8 this sequence of 8 stitches twice, where you're on the front needle, first stitch as if to purl and take it off, and then next stitch as if to purl. On the back needle, first stitch as if to knit and take it off, next stitch as if to knit, and then on the front needle, knit stitch, first stitch as if to knit and take it off, next stitch as if to knit and leave it on, and then back needle, first stitch as if to purl and take it off, next stitch as if to purl and leave it on. And then I'm going to repeat that sequence of 8 again. And so it is helpful. So when I use a cheat sheet, I don't just have it in front of me. I actually take a highlighter, and as I work each part of the sequence, I actually highlight through it. So that's what I've done. I make a highlight through, slash, take my highlighter and draw through it. I've done that. And so I will actually work this sequence of 8 and then kind of make an underline or something like that. And then the second time I work the sequence of 8, I'll do the slash through it. But that just kind of helps me keep track. So while I'm kind of on the subject of keeping track, if you have to at any point put down your project in the middle of doing the Kitchener stitch, this is where you want to do it. When you're in this, repeat this sequence of 4 steps over and over and over again until you're 7 stitches from the end. So find a very, very quiet place and work all the way until you're in the middle of this. And then once you're here, I would recommend that you work, so do this, do this, do this, do this, and stop after you've done the last step on the back needle, because then you can go and pick it up and know that you're always going to start on the first step on the front needle of this sequence. And so this is my recommendation. If you have to put it down, this is where you want to put it down, is when you're doing this repeat in the middle of the body stitches, after you've worked the final step of these 4 steps on the back needle. So again, if you want the cheat sheets, just let me know. I'm happy to post them in the forum. Recommendation number 5 is double up your yarn or more. Okay, so you can use more than one longer piece of yarn to do the Kitchener stitch join, especially for these very long joins. However, the more pieces you use, the more ends you have to weave in, and the nature of the stitch pattern that we're working into is going to leave you fewer stitches to work into. So just be aware it's going to be a little bit harder to hide your ends neatly if you use multiple pieces of multiple lengths of yarn to do it. So not only can you, so you could just attach your tapestry needle here and have your yarn almost all the way doubled up. So this is what I recommend, is double up until you have about a 2-inch stretch at the end before you're weaving it in. So you always have a single piece of yarn that's actually going into the stitch once you've pulled it all the way through. But you can actually double up what you've doubled up and put that, so you can actually pull like this is basically quadrupled length of thread or length of yarn through each stitch. It's just going to require a little bit more adjusting on your needle as you go to get, so you'll have to eventually adjust the doubled up portion so it's a different length, and then you'll eventually get down to having to need it to be a single length. But you can double it up and then double it up again, so that your length of yarn that you're having to pull through does not require so much tugging. Okay, so finally, the Kitchener stitch join. So again, whether you're doing your seed stitch edge, let me see if I can spread this out here. And now okay. So, or if you're doing your I-cord edge, and this is going to be messy because all my tails are back there. You're actually creating, so you have on your front needle, you've got your row 6 is what's on your front needle, and your row 2 is what's on your back needle. So your Kitchener stitch is actually going to be creating your row 7/8. It's going to be creating the light color row that comes across between that brings together the different trying to think how to say this. So you have the section of dark colored yarn that shifts, and so we're creating that shift with our light colored yarn that we're Kitchener stitching in across these pieces. And so it's already going to be a kind of thin row. So if you make it, if you, again, make it loose and then tighten it up as you go, you will end up with a fairly invisible join. All that to say, be aware that Kitchener stitch is not an exact join. Okay, so when you bring your stitches together, you're actually putting live loops next to live loops, and our live loops, if you look here, are actually going in the opposite direction of each other, so they're kind of butting into each other, and there's no way to do a join so that the live loops come together exactly. So our Kitchener stitch is actually offset by a half stitch. Okay, it's going to be, if you look really closely, you will see the shift, but because of where we're putting the shift, it's going to be very, very hard to detect once it's all cinched down and in the right, once it's the right size, it's going to be very, very difficult to detect. So I think it's totally worth doing the Kitchener stitch join to get your symmetrical piece all put together. It's just going to be a little time consuming. So while I do recommend finding a very quiet place where you can just concentrate and focus on get it done. Once you have it done, if you worked it loosely, you can totally like sit and watch a movie or listen to an audiobook or something when you're doing the adjustment, because that is just, especially once you get past the edge stitches, once you get past especially in the seed stitch, but once you get past the edge stitches, you're just pulling the legs of each stitch over to the tail of the yarn. So in one direction, you're just pulling the tails, or you're loosening each leg, or tightening one leg and loosening the next leg all the way across until you get to the edge again. And so it's pretty simple to do the loosening, which is what I'm going to show you right now. Actually, it's pretty simple to do the tightening, which is what I'm going to show you now. So you can see here with my seed stitch panels joined together that the Kitchener stitch join that I did is very, very loose. And so I've got this large row of stitches connecting my two panels together. But because all the excess can be pulled over to the tail, I can actually cinch each stitch down as I go and kind of check it to make sure it's the size the size it is comparable to the stitches above and below it, and essentially create the correct size row as I go. And so, like I said, once you get into the body of this is you can sit down and watch a TV show while you're doing it. It's very mindless work, but it will take a little bit of time to do. So one of the things you may want to do before you start is actually put a stitch marker on your very first, like when you go into that first stitch, as if to, so if you're doing the seed stitch edge, you're going to go into the very first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and leave that on there. And if you're doing the I-cord edge, you're going to go into the very first stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave that on there. And I would just recommend putting a stitch marker on that piece of yarn that's going to the front loop, just so that you know where your Kitchener stitch yarn is actually beginning. You will have other loose stitches around both edges because you're going to have, on both sides, you're going to have 3 pieces of yarn from you're going to have your I-cord yarn, your working yarn, your light color working yarn, and your dark color working yarn on both sides. And so you are going to have other things that are going to allow the stitches to loosen up, and you want to only be cinching down one thing at a time. And so if you know where your Kitchener stitch starts, it's easier to begin cinching it, especially with the seed stitch edge, where it's hard to differentiate whether the loose stitch is coming from your Kitchener join or from one of those other pieces of yarn. So just a recommendation. So once you've isolated your Kitchener stitch yarn, you can essentially just follow it, and you're just going to pull each stitch until it seems snug and about the right size compared to the previous stitch. And then it's just a matter of kind of following it around and figuring out how to get each the excess here moving in the direction of the tail. So these first few stitches are a little tricky. This one comes down here. You just want to make sure you're pulling in the correct direction each time. So again, I use my blunt tapestry needle so that I'm not snagging anything else. I'm just grabbing the yarn that I need to cinch. I'm not going to make you watch me do this all the way across, but I am going to get over to the body so I can show you how easy it is to cinch the stitches down once you've gotten over there. And remember, you don't want to make them too small because it's harder to get the yarn back across. Like I would err on the side of needing to do this twice than having to pull yarn back out of the tail to get stitches bigger. So once you've gotten past, once you've gotten the excess yarn through that purl stitch that's on the inside edge of the stitch marker, this becomes fairly straightforward. So from here, you're essentially just, you want to kind of move your yarn out of the way, find the next leg, cinch it down, find the next leg, cinch it down. I always like to pull my excess over to the left so I can find the next stitch. And I'm just looking, try to zoom in here a little bit and try to remember to zoom back out. So I'm looking at the stitch size that I'm creating and comparing it to the stitch below, above and below. And so you do want to keep in mind you have these slip stitches that are going to be longer, so don't make it that length, but make it the length of your regular size stitches that you're working. So I'm just going to pull my excess to the left, grab the next leg, pull it through, grab the next leg, pull it through. And in doing this, you can just work it all the way across to your tail, one leg at a time, basically, so that you get the exact size row that you want. So at this point, I'm going to jump ahead so that you can just see at the very end. You can see already, just with this amount, I've got about probably 7 inches of excess yarn already. And that's just from the edge stitches, and then maybe, so 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stitches, this much excess. So, but I'll jump ahead to the end here so you can see what it looks like when I get all the excess to the end where the tail is. Okay, so now that I've pulled my excess out of the entirety of the stretch, you can see that I have, I'm gonna actually, I essentially have 14 inches of excess yarn that was just in this tiny little 24 stitch piece. So once I pull that into my tail, and then do the cinching of the other, basically you've got, remember you have 3 other strands of yarn on both edges that need to be, well, 3 on one and 2 on the other, that are going to need to be fill in any holes or whatever before you start to weave your ends in. But basically, there's your join. And like I said, it's not entirely invisible, but it's pretty close. Unless you know somebody's looking for this, it's going to look so close to what you already have. It's going to be hard to tell. If you zoom in one more time for you here. Hopefully that doesn't shake a little bit. So if you look really carefully, you can see the shift. So you can see that my green stitches on this piece that was my, technically this was my back piece. This was my row 2, and this is my row 6 here. But you can see that these stitches here are shifting slightly to the right to meet up with the Kitchener row, which is then a half stitch off. So I've got my loop here, that's the V, and then the V down here is going, it's actually here. And so it is a half stitch over, but unless you're looking for it, you won't know what to look for, and it should look symmetrical. So hope that's helpful. If you have been doing the symmetrical version with the I-cord edges, this is how we're going to finish out clue 12 and then do the bind off. We're going to be joining the live stitches on either edge of both cables together to complete the transition from one side to the other. So to to start out, when you are working clue 12, we're basically just going to do that final color transition. So you're going to be transitioning from your clue 11 colors, which are I and J, to your clue 12 colors, which would be your K and your L. I have done more rows here and on my other swatch than are actually written in the pattern. I just wanted to have enough of a size to be able to go, grab something substantial enough that I could hold on to when I'm doing the join. So that's why there's more rows than actually you will be working, unless you're doing extra, which you totally can. So this is for your cable A. You're going to end after working a row 6, which means if you're looking at the front side of your work, you should have your light color working yarn is going to be coming from the second stitch in on the right side. It's going to be attached to that second stitch. Your dark color working yarn should be at the stitch marker, and then you should have the 3 dark colored stitches and then the 2 light color before you begin the pattern of 4 dark, 2 light, 4 dark, 2 light, all the way across. And then at the very end, you should have 3 more dark stitches, and then your light color bobbin should be basically a stitch away from the stitch marker, should be attached to that second stitch to the left of the stitch marker. And you're just going to cut all 3 of those colors when you finish your cable A. So you should have 3 tails there, and your end of cable A should look like this, where that's where the live stitches are. Your cable B is going to be, you're going to work through a row 2. So you're just going to work both of these the same pattern that you were working in clue 11. You're just going to work it with the new colors. And you're going to end after a row 2. So with the I-cord edges, you're not doing anything different when you're working these. With the seed stitch edges, there are a few changes, but with the I-cord edges, it's the same. So at the end of a row 2, you should have, when looking at the front of your work, your light color working yarn should be attached again to the second stitch in on the right, should be coming out of that stitch. Your dark color working yarn should be at the stitch marker. You should have 1 dark colored stitch and then 1 light colored stitch, and then have the pattern of 4 dark, 2 light all the way across until you get to the very end, and then you should have 1 more set of 4 dark, and then the 1 light, 1 dark, and then your stitch marker, and then your light color bobbin is attached to the second stitch in after the stitch marker, and you're going to cut your light color bobbin and your dark colored working yarn at that point. It does say when you finish cable B for both versions of the symmetrical that you want to leave color L. You actually don't have to. You can cut your color L working yarn now if you're doing the I-cord edges, because we're going to be attaching it differently anyway. Okay, so from there, you've finished the pattern part, and it's time to do the joining part, which is technically your bind off. You're going to be binding off all the live stitches by basically attaching them together. So there's one kind of important thing that I really recommend you do. You don't have to do it, it's optional, but it's really going to help ensure that your I-cord edge is continuous. So we had this border coming around the bottom, so we cast on the I-cord at the very beginning of the project in a very specific way so that it would make it look like the border goes all the way around without any visible seam anywhere. And so we want to continue that. Now, we could join the I-cord stitches exactly the way they are right here. So we could just join these 5 stitches to these 5 stitches. Now, the problem is that we don't actually work the stitch, like when we do the I-cord join, we're going to be working the stitches in the order that they are. Okay, so we're going to be creating a stitch between the stitch on the bottom and the stitch on the top. When we do that Kitchener stitch join, we're going to be creating stitches there. And so we have to work each stitch in the order that it appears on the needle. And if we do that, then we're actually going to be working the I-cord stitches out of order unless we rearrange them. So kind of to basically demonstrate why this is necessary, I wanted to kind of I've worked up this is a little a little piece of I-cord with nothing attached to it, just to help demonstrate what it is that we're looking at. So if you think about, if you've ever worked traditional I-cord, now the I-cord that we do in this is not traditional. I know that back when we started, there were some people that were very frustrating because they couldn't just work I-cord the way that they've become used to working I-cord. Normally, if you were going to create I-cord, what you would do is you'd take however many stitches, it's usually 3, but sometimes it's 4 or 5, and you would just knit all the way across those stitches, and then you would slide them back to the other side, and then you would knit again. So if you were doing that, if you were creating that I-cord border that way, where you were just knitting across one edge and then slipping across on the other side, you would be creating 1 row of stitches for every 2 rows of knitting. And you would end up with a very tight, very short, too short border. And so to get around this, to create a more substantial and slightly more stretchy I-cord border, we're working the I-cord the way that it's written in the pattern. And because we're doing that, the stitches that we're working are not in order. They are actually out of order. So even though we're creating this nice little squishy tube on the end, because we work, let me see, let me get a different colored pointer so it makes more sense. So we work a stitch and then we skip a stitch, and we work a stitch and we skip a stitch, and we work a stitch, and then we come back around and we skip the one we just worked, and then we work a stitch and skip a stitch and work a stitch and skip a stitch. And so because we're doing it in that order, we actually have to put these stitches in that same order before we join the edges. Otherwise, we're going to end up, when we make those, when we make the stitches by working the Kitchener moves, we're creating 2 rows that look like knitting on the front and will actually be purling on the back. So you would end up, if you just work the stitches in the order that they come right here, you're going to end up with 2 rows of purl bumps on the back of your work, and it won't be a completely, it won't look the same, won't look quite the same on the front. It will still kind of continue the knit stitches up, but it will be a visible edge change. So to avoid the invisible edge change, we actually have to figure out what order these stitches are actually in. And so I'm actually going to pop my needle out here because I wanted to show you this. So make it do what it's supposed to do. All right, so when you take your needle out, you can see that rather than having 5 stitches in a row, you kind of have a clump of stitches, okay? Almost like a circle of stitches. So you can kind of actually go around the circle, and that actually helps us see where these stitches land. So we actually, they go on the needle, this stitch, and then that stitch, and then this stitch, and that stitch, and this stitch. But the order that they're worked in when we actually work the stitches is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, kind of in this round. And so what we need to do is actually get these stitches reordered so that when we start to work them, we have that 5th stitch on the needle first, and then the 4th stitch, and then the 3rd stitch, and then the 2nd stitch, and then the 1st stitch. And so that's when we're looking at our right needle, we want those stitches from the back to come around and be on the front edge so that we can work them first. And then on the other side, so that would be how we would order the stitches on the right pointing needle when we're looking at the front of the work. So these same stitches on the left side, we have to pick up in the opposite order. So we actually need this stitch from the back that has the working yarn attached first. I want to make sure, I think it's starting to come out. Let me see. Okay, so we need that stitch, and then this stitch, and then we need to come around and get these stitches that were on the front. That one, and then that one, and then that one, so that our last stitch worked in the order is going to be, so this will be how it looks on our left pointing needle, is those stitches from the back have now, that were back here, have come around and they're now on the left edge of the needle. So I'm going to show you how to reorder those stitches the way that I recommend on, I'm just going to do 1 needle on either side. Okay, when looking at the front of your work, beginning at the stitch marker to the tip of your needle, going from left to right. So we have 1, 5, 2, 4, 3. And we actually want them to be 1, 2, 3, and then 4 and 5. So 5th stitch, this stitch right here, needs to be closest to the needle tip. this stitch right here needs to be the second closest, and then this one, and this one need to be the third, fourth, and fifth, or the, yeah. So it needs to be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in that order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to the wrong side of my work, and it might be easier to pull your stitches onto the cable to do this. Take the tip of I use a smaller needle, so this is, my stitches are on a size 6 needle. This is a size 2 needle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go purlwise into the stitches that I need to move. So I'm going to skip this stitch that's closest to the stitch marker, and I'm going to go purlwise into the next stitch. And you want to do this as cleanly as you can. Then I'm going to skip that next stitch, which is the third stitch, and I'm going to go purlwise into that fourth stitch, and then I'm just going to pull my needle through and get those up on the cable. Then I'm going to turn around, and I want to make sure everything turns. So not just my work, but actually the cable that I'm putting those on. So they're still in the right order. So you can kind of hold the two cables together, and you can see the stitches are still straight on there. I'm not twisting them or anything. Then I'm going to pull my needle, so I still have those up on the cable, and then I'm going to come and pick up these other 3 stitches so that I can move everything at the same time. So then I'm going to go purlwise into this first stitch and skip the second one, and then purlwise into the third one and skip the fourth one, and purlwise into the fifth one. And then I'm going to pull those up onto the cable as well, and then I'm going to push everything off of the current needle. So I'm going to just pull that off, and I'm going to make sure I leave my stitch marker on there, and that's all that comes off. So now I have all my stitches on this spare cable. Then I'm going to actually pull them. I'm going to pull them so that everything is up next to each other on the cable. So I'm going to kind of pull the cable together, which it's a very long cable, so bear with me here a second. And don't be worried, they're going to stretch out a little bit when you do that, and then they'll just all kind of pop in there. And then I'm going to pull so that I can move those stitches back tip to tip, so I want to make sure everything's still straight. And I'm just going to slip each one of those stitches back to my left needle of my main cable here in the order that I've just placed them. So now I've got those 3 stitches from the front, and then the 2 that came off the back, and they're all in order now from 1 to 5 on the tip of my needle. So starting at the stitch marker, stitch 1, all the way to stitch 5 next to the tip of the needle. When you're reordering your stitches, specifically the stitches that are to the right end of your needle, you're going to end up with the working yarn, the light colored working yarn, or your light colored working tail coming from the front of that second stitch. And so you just want to pull this first stitch off to the other needle, and then you want to bring that working yarn between the needles, between the needles to the back, just so that it's in the correct position. Okay. If you make sure you bring it between that first and second stitch, otherwise you're going to end up what looks like a purl bump on that first stitch, and you don't want that. Okay. So just when you do that reordering, you want to make sure that that working yarn is coming between the first and second stitch to the back of your work. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same thing with the stitches that are on the left end of my needle. And I did order them the same way. I'm trying to prevent confusion. It's hard to use words to say what is easier to demonstrate visually. But beginning at your stitch marker to the tip of your needle, your stitches are in the current order of 1, 5, 2, 4, 3. And we need it to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So our first stitch is here, our second stitch is here, our third stitch is here, and then again on the back of the work, the fourth stitch is here and the fifth stitch is here. So again, I'm going to turn to the back of my work because I need the fifth stitch to be the one that's closest to the end, so that's the one I'm going to pick up first. So once I get these down on the cable, I'm going to skip the one that's closest to the stitch marker, and then I'm going to come purlwise into that second stitch. And again, you just want to try to pick these up as cleanly as possible. And then I'm going to skip that third stitch, go purlwise into the fourth stitch, and then skip that last stitch. And then I'm going to pull my cable through, turn back to the front and make sure everything is staying in order. So I want to kind of bring my cable, sorry, it's a really long cable. It's kind of unwieldy. So I want to just make sure that everything back here is still in order with everything back there and that I didn't twist it around, okay? Then I'm going to take the point of my needle again, and I'm going to go purlwise into, from the left, this first stitch. I want to make sure I just get into the stitch and nothing else. So go into that first stitch, just being kind of a pill right now, okay? And then I'm going to skip that second stitch, and then I'm going to go purlwise into that third stitch and skip the fourth stitch, and then go purlwise into that fifth stitch. So now I should have on my needle those 3 stitches from the front, and on my cable those 2 stitches from the back. And actually everything's going through the main cable. And then I'm going to pull those up onto my cable, and then I'm going to pull everything off of my main needle. So I'm going to push that out up to the stitch marker, but leave the stitch marker on it. All right, pull out my needle, and then I'm just going to pull my cable until everything's in the same place. Pull, and it'll pop. All right, and then when everything is in the same place, I'm going to make sure it's all straight on with my work, that I haven't twisted it around. And I'm going to push it so that everything's on the needle again, and then I'm just going to transfer them tip to tip back to my right needle. And just, again, you want to make sure that you're going cleanly through each stitch, because as you join these stitches, you do want to go through them cleanly, or you're not going to have a smooth join. It'll make it more visible if you don't get cleanly through each stitch. Okay, so now on one of my cables, I have reordered the stitches on both the right end and the left end of my cable. And so you just want to do that for both cables before we actually begin doing the Kitchener stitch join. So go ahead and do that on your other cable. You can use the timestamps to jump back to the place on the video that goes through that if you need to watch it again. So now it is time to get set up to actually do our join. To do that, you want to take the stitches that are on your cable B, and you're going to slide them all the way to the left end of your needle. Because we're actually going to turn this so that the wrong side is facing us, and we want our stitches that we're joining to start on this end. So that's where your cable B stitches should be. If you're trying to remember how to keep track of which one is which, remember cable B, we ended at a row 2, so we just have that one dark stitch next to the marker before the light stitch on either side. So should go dark light and then the 4 and 2. Whereas with our cable A, we have the 3 dark stitches next to the stitch marker before the 2 light colored stitches. Stitches that are on cable A, those are going to be facing you, so you want them all the way to the right of your needle. And I'm just using one long circular needle to do this. Obviously you're probably going to have all your stitches on 2 separate cables. All right. So once you have all your stitches in order, you get your I-cord edges set up so that those stitches are in the right order. You want to take a very, very long piece of your light colored working yarn. So my suggestion is, if you are willing to put in the time and effort, it is totally worth doing it with one strand. So you want to basically get, like lay your stuff out, just one cable, lay it out so that the stitches are as wide as possible. And you want to actually, if your stitches have to be scrunched up on your cable because it's not as long as the project, I would take a piece of the project that's further down and use that as your guide. So like get one of the wider pieces and then take your yarn and basically come across that nice, and don't pull it tight, just that length, and then pull it around and get another length going back across. And you want to basically get 5 full lengths of your project worth of yarn before you cut a tail. You can do a shorter piece of yarn. You can do short segments, and just you basically want to leave a good sized tail to weave in on either end of the section of yarn that you're using. So you can use shorter sections if you want. Yes, it's a lot of work to pull all that yarn through every single stitch. But in doing it, I found it was a lot easier to do it that way than to, I hate weaving in ends. So I'll just leave it at that. I find it really hard. And because of the pattern where we are, there's just not a lot of, like, obviously you can try to hide it through the back. It's going to kind of show back here. But there's just not a lot of light colored stitches to weave it into. And so it's just a lot more work, the more tails that you have doing this. So totally up to you whether you do it. If you're going to do it in one fell swoop, you do need a piece of yarn, a length of yarn that is at least 5 times the length of your project before you cut that tail. So decide what you want to do. Measure once, cut twice. No, measure twice, cut once. 5. All right, so cut your tail with maybe a little bit more margin than you think you need. And then you're going to attach your yarn to a tapestry needle. So at this point, it's not going to be attached to your project anywhere. It's just on your tapestry needle. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is you don't necessarily have to weave your tails in now, but if you tuck them out of the way, you will find it much more helpful because your Kitchener yarn is going to want to snag on everything. It's going to want to pull around and find things to get hung up on. So the more things that you can get out of the way before you start, the easier this will be to do. Okay, so rather than just doing our setup, setting up those first 2 stitches and then working the same 4 movements over and over and over again like you would do with a normal Kitchener stitch, we are doing a slightly modified thing, and that's because we need to accommodate this purl stitch. So looking at the front of the work, this stitch all the way down the edge, we've purled it every time we come to it on the front, knit it every time we come to the back, and so it needs to be treated like a purl stitch for both the front and back needle. And so that's why I had you leave your stitch markers on, is just, so obviously it's a little easier at the beginning because you're doing 4 stitches the same way. After you do your setup, you're doing 4 stitches the same way, but you're going to work this stitch a little bit differently, and then you're going to work this stitch a little bit differently on both needles. And then once you get into the main body, you're going to work all these stitches the same all the way until you get to the stitch before the stitch before the stitch marker. So you're going to work all the way up to 2 stitches before the stitch marker. That second stitch before the stitch marker is going to be worked slightly different. That stitch before the stitch marker is going to be slightly different. And then we're going to go back after the stitch marker to finish out the way that we've been working across. So we're going to have the 5 knit stitches and then a purl stitch on the front and the back, and then all these knit stitches across. And then right before we get to the end, we're going to have that other purl stitch that we need to treat like a purl. Okay, so that's why the instructions for the Kitchener stitch are a little bit more complex than just your basic Kitchener stitch. All right, so let us actually Kitchener stitch our I-cord together. So we're going to start with the I-cord. We're going to do a setup. So we're going to go into that first stitch on the front needle purlwise, and you just want to pull your tail until you've got basically a long enough to weave in tail and nothing more. And you want to kind of adjust your yarn so that you still have a little bit of one strand. So first stitch as if to purl, or that stitch on the front needle as if to purl, and then we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit. And that just gets us set up to begin the Kitchener stitch join. Now we are going to work the next 4 steps 4 times. We're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off the needle, and then go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. Then we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off, and go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. So now we've bound off 2 stitches. So we've done that once. Let's do that again. Go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. You want to make sure that your yarn is not coming over the needles, by the way. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. We've now bound off 2 stitches. So we're going to do that again. Sorry. All right. Go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. Do that again. Go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to purl and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. So now we've bound off 4 stitches, and this is where we switch our technique slightly, and it's just for the next 2 stitches. All right, now we're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. Remove that stitch marker. Go into the next stitch on the front needle also as if to knit and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. You can remove that stitch marker as well. Go into the next stitch on the back needle also as if to purl and leave it on. So now we've bound off the 5 edge stitches on either needle, and we're going to finish out by working this, doing this purl stitch. So our next stitch, we're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off. And then we're going to go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. Then we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring it off. And go into the next stitch on the back needle also as if to knit, and we're going to leave that on. All right, so that's it for the funky stitches at the beginning, and until you get to 2 stitches before your stitch marker on the end of your row, you're going to be working the same 4 steps that I'm going to do here over and over and over again. And that is, go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. And so you're going to just do this over and over again. And so I always use kind of a shorthand when I'm doing this. So I go on the front needle, knit, off, purl, on. Back needle, purl, off, knit, on. Again, front needle, knit, making sure I just go through the stitch, knit, off, purl, on, back needle, purl, off, knit, on. And you can start doing this pretty quickly. So you would go, always remember you start these next 4 stitches, you're always working starting on the front, do 2 on the front, 2 on the back. So knit, off, purl, back needle, purl, off, knit, front needle, knit, off, purl, purl, off, this is the back needle, by the way, purl, off, knit. And then you're just working those 4 stitches over and over and over again until you get to, until you get to 2 stitches before the stitch marker at the very end. Okay, so my recommendation is, if you need to set this down and put it aside at some point, always finish with the 2 stitches that you do on the back needle and then leave that. And so you're going to come back and always begin with the 2 stitches on the front needle. So knit, off, purl, 2 stitches on the back needle, purl, off, knit. And so you could just set this down, walk away, come back, know that the first 2 things you need to do are going to be on the front needle, same thing you always do, knit, off, purl, back needle, purl, off, knit. And as you can see, so I'm going to just pull my needles out of the way a little bit. So you can see where we've begun the join. If you look really closely at the edge stitches over here, it can look like they're maybe not perfectly joined, but once you get your tails all stitched down and everything there, it's going to be virtually invisible where that join is, and it'll look like those stitches just continue up like they're supposed to. Sorry, I've got a little, can't find my right tail there. There we go. So any discrepancy that you see is literally because when we attach, so when we're not attaching the stitches stitch to stitch, we're actually attaching the stitches a half a stitch over. But again, unless you know where to look for that join, and once you block it, it's going to be impossible to tell where that happened. Okay, so you'll have this row right here where the stitch pattern continues, where it looks like you just continued there, but in fact you're actually continuing to do this join all the way across. So I will meet you over there where we are 2 stitches from the edge marker, and you can just continue doing your 2 stitches on the front, knit, off, purl, and 2 stitches on the back, purl, off, knit. Okay, so once you have 2 stitches remaining on either needle, you will have actually worked into each of those stitches, the beginning of those stitches, but you haven't removed them from the needle yet. So you would have just done a purl into this stitch on the front needle and done a knit into the stitch on the back needle. And we're going to work those stitches and then set up these 2 stitches, which are going to be our purl bumps on the edge again. So that last stitch before the purl stitch that we need to do. So when we're 2 stitches away from the stitch marker, we're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit, bring it off, and then going to the next stitch on the needle also as if to knit and leave it on. And then on the back needle, we're going to go into that first stitch on the needle as if to purl and bring it off, and then go into the next stitch on the back needle also as if to purl and leave it on. And again, just make sure you're bringing your working yarn between the needles and not over the needle when you do this. And then to work this purl stitch here, we're going to go into the stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off. And you can move that stitch marker. And then we're going to go into the next stitch on the needle also as if to purl and leave it on. I'm going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring it off and remove that stitch marker, and then go into the next stitch also as if to knit and leave it on. So that works that purl stitch on both sides. Now we're going to do the same stitch that we've been doing for the next 4 stitches. So we're going to go back to our knit into the first stitch and bring it off the needle, and then go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl, go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off, go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on, repeat that, front needle, knit, off, purl, on, back needle, purl off, knit, on, front needle, knit, off, purl, on, back needle, purl, off, knit, on, front needle, knit, off, purl, on, back needle, purl, off, knit, on. And then we have those last 2 stitches, 1 stitch on either needle. We've already done the setup on each one of those, and so to end, we're just going to go knitwise into the one on the front needle and bring it off. Go purlwise into the one on the back needle and bring it off. And that should be the end of your Kitchener join. You want to kind of give your pieces a little tug. And obviously you want to kind of cinch down anything that seems loose. And with your I-cord edges, you just want to make sure that you let them roll back around. So because we straightened those stitches out, when we pulled those stitches from the back to the front to work them, you want to let them roll back around to the back. And then if necessary, you can adjust them to even out the stitches. Okay, if you are doing the symmetrical version with the seed stitch edge, to begin, we're going to kind of pop back to the end of clue 12 and how that gets worked. So technically you're going to start the same, you're going to do the color transition the same on both cables, and you're going to work rows 5 through 8 on both cables, and then you're going to split. So this is going to be cable A. We're going to kind of go over cable A first. So cable A, you're going to work rows 1 through 5, which is what I have on here right now. And then to complete cable A, before we do the bind off setup and everything, at the end of row 5, so when you turn to the wrong side to do row 6, you're actually not going to work the edge stitches on either end. So you're going to slip the first 5 stitches to your needle, your right needle, at the beginning here, which is going to leave your bobbin working yarn all the way at the right side of your work. On the wrong, when the wrong side is facing you, your bobbin yarn should be all the way to the right. Slip the stitch marker, and then you're just going to work with the dark color the main part of row 6. So knit the first stitch, and then the stitch repeat is purl 2, slip 2, purl 2, and the slip stitches are with the yarn in front. Just do that again, purl 2, slip 2, purl 2 with the yarn in front, and then when you have 1 stitch remaining, you're just going to knit that, and then bring that working yarn back towards you so it's in front, and then you're not going to work the 5 stitches at this end either, so you're just going to slip the stitch marker and then slip those 5 stitches to the right needle. So at the end of your row 6, when you turn back to the right side of the work with the front facing you, you should have your 5 edge stitches, and then the working yarn, the working light colored yarn, should be at the stitch marker. So should your dark color working yarn. So those should kind of be coming out from the same place. And then your bobbin working yarn should be all the way on the left. And at this point, you can cut all 3 colors. Okay, just make sure you leave a long enough tail to weave in, but you can cut all the colors, or all the yarn for cable A. On cable B, you're going to start the same way. So you're going to do the color transition as it's written, and then work rows 5 through 8. And then on your cable B, you're going to work rows 1 through 8, and then work rows 1 and 2. So at the end of your row 2, when you're looking at the front of the work, the bobbin yarn should be on the left side at the stitch marker. Your dark color working yarn should be on the right side at the stitch marker, and your light color working yarn should be on the very right side of the work. So at this point, you can cut your bobbin yarn and your dark color working yarn. Okay, don't cut your color L yet, your main light color working yarn just yet. Yes, mine's cut, but we're going to ignore that. Okay, don't cut it yet because we need to do a little bit more. At this point, we need to go into our setup to get ready to do the bind off with both of the sides of the symmetrical. With your right side of your cable B looking at you, we're actually going to work these 5 edge stitches one more time. So just the same way as always, you're going to slip that first stitch knitwise with the yarn in front, purl, knit, purl, knit. At this point, you're going to take off the stitch marker, and then you're going to slip all 5 of these edge stitches back to the left needle. And just make sure you slip them back cleanly so that you're not catching any of the yarn. And then this is where you're going to cut your main working color L working yarn. So now you should have your dark color and light color should be at the same place, those working yarns, even though they're both cut now. And then again, your working yarn for your bobbin, or your bobbin yarn, is going to be at the stitch marker on the left side. Once you've done that, we're going to slide the stitches all the way to the other end of the needle so that the end of the front is on the tip of the right needle now. now right needle, okay? And we're going to slip, these 5 edge stitches to the left needle. Remove this stitch marker. And at this point, we are going to take our working yarn that we just cut, and we are going to attach it on this end, and we're going to work these 5 edge stitches as we would normally work 5 edge stitches at the end of the row. So knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1. So that's going to leave your light color working yarn coming from the very end of the left side of the front. Once we've done that, we are going to turn this cable so that the wrong side is facing us. And you should have your entirety of your color L working yarn attached at the very right end of that needle. Pick up your cable A, and you're going to have it so that it is facing you, and you're just going to put it so that the wrong sides of the 2 pieces are facing each other. So you should have both right sides facing out. And your working yarn should be coming from this back needle. So this is how you're going to have your everything set up to begin joining these 2 pieces. Okay, we're going to start off by going into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit, and we're going to leave that stitch on the needle. We're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl, and we're going to also leave that stitch on the needle. And then we're going to begin, we're going to work off these first 7 stitches. That stitch pattern is going to keep changing. Once we get past the 7th stitch, you're going to be doing the same stitch pattern 2 stitches on the front, 2 stitches on the back, over and over and over again until you get to the last 7 stitches, and then we're going to go back to a switching up stitch pattern. So these first stitches, first stitch, you're going to go into the front, first stitch on the front needle as if to purl, bring it off the needle, go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl, and leave it on. And you do want to make sure that your yarn doesn't accidentally wrap around your needle or anything like that. You're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring that off. And yes, your tail can sometimes get in your way. Just kind of untangle everything. All right, so that back needle, you went into the first stitch as if to knit, and it brought that stitch off the needle. And then we're going to go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. So now we bound off 1 stitch from each needle. Now we're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring that off. And then go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to knit and leave it on. Then we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off the needle. And then go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to purl and leave it on. You always want to make sure that your yarn is coming down between the needles and underneath them and not around them. All right, so now we've bound off 2 stitches from each needle. We're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off the needle. And then go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. Then we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring it off the needle. And then go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. Now we've bound off 3 stitches from each needle. We're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. And then we're going to go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to knit and leave it on. We're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. And go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to purl and leave it on. So now we have bound off 4 stitches from each needle. Now at this point, we're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off. And go ahead and remove your stitch marker. And then we're going to go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to knit and leave it on. Then we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring it off. And then we're going to go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to purl and leave it on. So now we've bound off all of our edge stitches. We're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off. And we're going to go into the next stitch on the front needle also as if to purl and leave it on. And then we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring it off. And we're going to go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit, and we're going to leave that on. So now that we have bound off 6 stitches from the edge, we've gone through all of the stitches that needed the special treatment to maintain the seed stitch edge, and that edge stitch that's just inside the marker that we always purl on the front and always knit on the back, so that we maintain that as well. From here, we're just going to do the stitch repeat to bind off all but the last 7 stitches. So that goes like this. We're going to go through the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. So we're going to do a knit off, and then the next stitch we're going to go in as if to purl, and we're going to leave it on. Then we're going to go in the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off, and go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. So we're just going to do this over and over again. So on the front, we go knit, off, purl, on. On the back needle, purl, off, knit, on. Again, front needle, knit, off, purl, on. Back needle, purl, off, knit, on. Repeat again. Front needle, knit, off, purl, on. Back needle, purl, off, knit, on. Front needle, knit, off, purl, on. Back needle, purl, off, knit, on. Front needle, knit, off, purl, on. Back needle, purl, off, knit, on. Front needle, knit, off, purl, on. Back needle, purl, off, knit, on. And you're just going to keep doing that same stitch repeat. Knit off on the front needle, purl and leave it on the front needle, and then purl off on the back needle, and knit and leave it on. You just want to kind of keep moving your stitches up to the tips of your needle. Front needle, knit off, purl on, back needle, purl off, knit on. And once you get all the way to the end of your piece, when you have 7 stitches remaining, so I've got, let's see, 2 more stitches to bind off, then we're going to switch back. So knit off on the front, purl on the back, purl off, knit on. So I have one more set before I get to my last 7 stitches. So I'm going to go into this front stitch, knit, bring it off. Next stitch on the front needle as if to purl. And first stitch on the back needle, purl and bring it off. And go into the next stitch as if to knit. And that brings us to our last 7 stitches, which are worked a little differently than the rest of that row. So if you look here to what we've done so far, you can see that we've joined the 2 pieces and created that center row. All right. And once I get my stitches stitched down over here, you'll see that the seed stitch edge will be maintained. All right. So to do these last 7 stitches, we are going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off, and go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to knit. Then we're going to go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off, and go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to purl. Should have 6 stitches remaining. At this point, you're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off. And then you can remove that stitch marker. You're going to go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to knit and leave it on. And then on the back needle, you're going to go into the first stitch as if to knit and bring it off. And go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to purl and leave it on. All right, at this point, you should have 5 stitches remaining on either needle. At this point, you are going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to knit and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back as if to purl and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to purl and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring it off. Go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to knit and leave it on. And we're down to 2 stitches. We're going to go into the first stitch on the front needle as if to knit and bring it off. And go into the next stitch on the front needle as if to knit and leave it on. Go into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl and bring it off. And go into the next stitch on the back needle as if to purl and leave it on. And then to finish this out, we're just going to go into this stitch on the front needle as if to purl and bring it off, and go into the stitch on the back needle as if to knit and bring it off. And that is the end of the Kitchener stitch. And this is the point where you got to kind of tidy out your stitches at the edge, on either edge. And once you've done that, you should have a almost invisible seamless join that, once you get your ends woven in and everything, will be nearly impossible to see where it is unless you already knew where it was. Okay? So that is how to bind off your seed stitch, symmetrical, shawl, or blanket. Good luck. When you go to block, you want to come to your edge of clue 2 to the beginning of clue 3. And you basically want to stretch the top edge, so not down here where clue 1 and clue 2 come together, but this edge right here where clue 2 goes into clue 3. You want to stretch that top edge as much as it will go without distorting the color work pattern in clue 2. And you want to kind of pin it right there. Then, so you want to definitely pin your edges. And if you've been doing the I-cord edge, I recommend you pin not in the I-cord and not in this purl stitch, but in that first stitch inside where the purl is. So we want to pin right there as wide as it will go without distorting the edge pattern. Okay, so on both ends. Then once that's pinned, you actually want to pull your clue 3 as tall as you can on both sides, and then you're just going to relax it back so the edge is even with clue 2, and you're going to pin that as well. So you kind of pin clue 3 out as tall as it'll go, and basically you want to pull open that stitch pattern as much as you can without distorting it, and you don't want the edge to be wider than what you have clue 2 pulled to. And that's going to be your, once you have clue 3 blocked, so once you do that, you should have it blocked on both the top and bottom for clue 3. That should be your guideline for how wide the rest of the project is going to be. And so you want to pin out your edges, and you want to just stretch. So like each of the lace sections is going to stretch open. You want to stretch each of your patterns as much as you can, but then you want to pull out so that your edges are all even, all the way up. Okay, and so it's clues like clue 6. That's the reason you don't want to pin. It shouldn't be as bad as this because I didn't do a very good job on that edge. But if you pull too much at the edge and you pin in that purl area, you're going to have those floats are going to be showing. So you want to make sure you're pinning at the inside edge past that purl stitch, basically that next stitch. And I highly recommend, like the blocking combs are really, really helpful for this. You can use pens, you can use blocking wires to help get straight edges at the top and bottom of each clue. But you're just going to block out each edge, and I would strongly recommend that you actually use a spray bottle. So I use a spray bottle, I fill it almost to the top, and then I add just a little tiny bit of wool wash and just kind of give it a gentle shake, and then I spray down my project after I've pinned it in place. So that would be what I recommend for blocking this. When you're blocking, you can block by putting your pins in the edge, or you can block by putting your pins inside. So you have this area at the beginning and end of each row where we worked the edge stitches, and then we have that purl stitch. Like when you're looking at the front, you always work a purl stitch on the inside of the edge marker on either side, and then on the back side it's knit. And so we have this purl row that runs all the way up the edge of the blanket, okay? And that helps delineate, it helps like kind of create a separation between the main part of the blanket and the border part of the blanket. And so it's actually my recommendation that you put your blocking pins just inside that purl edge, like in that first row of knitting that's inside the purl row, okay, if that makes sense. And just kind of hand block your border flat, which it should sit nice and flat once you're all done. But the issue with if you, let's say, clue, what is it? Clue 8. This is clue 8. Okay, so here's a good example. Okay, so clue 8, if you block by pinning out your border, you're going to get stretched out stitches here next to your purl row. Okay, so it's going to depend on the patterning, but the sections that actually have 2 colors, it's going to show up more because you have the extra color next to the edge. And a lot of times we're working that extra, that purl stitch is going to be worked in either a different color, like 2 different colors. So you've got your border stitches that are all in one color. You've got your main body stitches that are like in the patterning. But then we have this one row of stitches that are not in either one. They're not patterned and they're not border. They're that purl row. And sometimes they have all the same color and sometimes they have alternating color. And so if you stretch your border out and pin that, you're going to end up with a very visible purl row. Whereas if you get your project to the length you want it to be and then pin at that edge, you're going to get that nice little edge that kind of curves over to where the purl stitches. I don't know if you can see that. So it kind of curves over it like the edge almost rolls into like a little tuck, and then you have the border stitches. So if you pin at the edge of your knitting, like the actual body of the project, pin in there, and then let that purl row kind of be left alone, and then just hand block your edge stitches so that they lay flat. I think you'll like the look of your blocked project a lot better than if you try to stretch it out and pin like all the way out to the border, if that makes sense. So totally up to you, just a recommendation I wanted to pass along.